Stop. Right now, put everything aside and look closely at these images. What do you see? Is this a monarch's residence? A country palace for an imperial family? Or perhaps the parliament building of a great power? No. Official historians, looking you straight in the eye, claim that this is a madhouse, a psychiatric asylum, an asylum for the insane of the 19th century. Do you feel resistance growing inside? This is your common sense screaming that you are being deceived. We have been lied to our whole lives about the purpose of these colossal structures, and today we will shatter this lie with dry logic, construction estimates, and facts that cannot be refuted. You have been deceived. All of us have fallen victim to a grand falsification, the scale of which is frightening. Ask yourself one simple question. Why in the mid-19th century, when, according to textbooks, people rode horses, heated stoves with wood, and medicine treated illnesses with bloodletting and mercury, did the state suddenly decide to build palaces for the mentally ill? Look at Trans-Allegheny in West Virginia, or the complex in Danvers. These are not just hospitals. These are architectural masterpieces of Victorian neo-Gothic. Spires, towers, intricate brickwork, granite foundations, marble floors, giant windows, and ventilation systems that even today engineers cannot replicate without electricity. Who actually built these giant structures? Why are scientists silent about the fact that the cost of erecting one such facility, when converted to modern currency, exceeds the budgets of small countries? The official version states that in the second half of the 19th century, the humanitarian idea of Dr. Thomas Kirkbride suddenly emerged. Supposedly, society became so imbued with compassion for the insane that it decided to allocate the best lands and colossal resources for their comfortable upkeep. But let's engage critical thinking. We are talking about a time when child labor was the norm, when factory workers died of exhaustion by the age of 30, when the concept of social welfare practically did not exist. And in this harsh, pragmatic world of capitalism, someone decides to spend millions of gold rubles or dollars on people who bring no economic benefit? This contradicts the very essence of the economy of that era. No state, no private investor would invest funds into an unprofitable asset with such luxury. This is economic absurdity. Let's turn to numbers, for mathematics is the only language in which it is impossible to lie. Let's take, for example, the psychiatric hospital in Buffalo. The complex of buildings, connected by curved corridors, resembles a giant bird with a wingspan of about 1/3 of a mile. Construction supposedly began in 1870. We are told that local sandstone was used. But can you imagine the volume of stone extraction? To build such a complex, industrial-scale quarries, railroads directly to the construction site, and thousands of skilled stonemasons would be needed. Where did they live? How were they fed? The city archives contain no records of a massive influx of labor capable of sustaining such a construction project. The city's population itself in those years could hardly afford to maintain such a facility, let alone build it. Another shocking fact is the speed of construction. Official sources often cite timelines of 3, 5, or 7 years. For a building covering hundreds of thousands of square feet, without tower cranes, without concrete pumps, without power tools, this is impossible even with modern technology if the quality standards of masonry we observe are met. The mortar joints between bricks in these buildings are often less than 1/10 of an inch. This is meticulous craftsmanship. Who were these masters? Where were the schools that produced them? Why, after the end of the Asylum era, did this craftsmanship suddenly disappear, and we began to build drab concrete boxes? The answer is simple and terrifying. These buildings were most likely not constructed in the 19th century. They were excavated. They were restored. They were appropriated. Look at old photographs of the so-called construction phase. Do you often see scaffolding? Do you see the process of laying the foundation? In most cases, we are shown already completed building shells around which people with wheelbarrows are bustling, looking more like scavengers or archaeologists than builders. They are not building. They are clearing the area. Pay attention to the ground floors. Why do the ground floor windows of these palaces for the insane often disappear below ground? Historians will tell you about window wells and basement lighting. But why create full-fledged windows with arched vaults where there should be a solid foundation? This is a classic sign that the ground level has risen. The building stands deeper than originally planned. These are not basements. These are former ground floors, buried as a result of an unknown cataclysm. And the most significant contradiction: capacity and purpose. These buildings were designed as autonomous cities. They had their own power plants, or what we call boiler houses, their own farms, their own water supply systems. Why such autonomy for a madhouse? This looks more like arks, like refuges for the elite, designed for survival in conditions of complete isolation. Or perhaps these were the palaces of the nobility of a previous civilization, which the new masters of the world simply didn't know how to use, and decided to gather all the undesirable people there, all those who remembered the old world, declaring them insane. Imagine this scenario for a second. Mid-19th century. The world is recovering from some global catastrophe. Cities stand half empty. Magnificent ancient and Gothic structures are abandoned. The new power, having seized control, faces a problem. There are huge empty palaces, and there is a population, part of which is traumatized, and part remembers what it shouldn't. What would you do? You would call the palaces hospitals. You would lock up the witnesses there. You would invent a legend about the great Dr. Kirkbride and humanitarianism. This is the perfect cover. No one would go check what's happening behind the high walls of a psychiatric hospital. It's an exclusion zone. It's a prison disguised as a sanatorium. Let's look at demographics. 19th century statistics on the number of mentally ill people show an anomalous, explosive growth. Why would that be? Life got better. Progress is sweeping across the planet, and people are massively losing their minds. The number of patients in such institutions doubled every decade. This is not an epidemic of schizophrenia. This is a purge. This is social filtering. But to maintain such an armada of prisoners, space was needed. And it was found. It was already standing, ready. Majestic, with ceilings about 16 feet high, with huge halls that were later partitioned with plywood into small cubicle wards. Have you ever seen a hospital ward with stucco molding on the ceiling and a carved marble fireplace? In these asylums, it's the norm. They try to explain this to us as beauty therapy. Supposedly, the sight of beauty heals the soul. Seriously? In an era when lobotomies and electroshock were treatments, was anyone concerned about the aesthetics of stucco for violent patients? This is a lie, thinly veiled. Analysis of the brickwork, the logistics of material supply, and the lack of sensible project documentation all point to one thing. We are dealing with a cargo cult. Those who called themselves builders were simply occupying empty shells. They carried out cosmetic repairs, installed bars on the windows, and put up a sign that read, "State Asylum." But the most interesting part is yet to come. If we carefully study the plans of these buildings, we will find technical discrepancies that baffle modern engineers. Air circulation systems built into the walls that work without fans. acoustics that allow a whisper to be heard at the other end of a corridor over 300 feet long. These are technologies we have lost, technologies of sound and vibration. What were these complexes actually built for? Certainly not to house unfortunate people in straitjackets. Have you ever tried to calculate the number of bricks required to erect one such asylum? Let's do some simple arithmetic that makes official historians' eyes twitch. Let's take, for example, the asylum in Ohio, or the famous Greystone Park in New Jersey. By the most conservative estimates of engineers, the construction of the main building required between 10 and 25 million bricks. 25 million. Do you comprehend the scale of that number? In the mid-19th century, when bricks were molded almost by hand and firing was done in primitive kilns, producing such a volume of material in a short time frame is nonsense. But even if we assume that secret superfactories were operating somewhere, the question of logistics arises. A single horse-drawn wagon, pulled by a pair of draft horses, could transport a maximum of 300 or 400 bricks over the broken dirt roads of that era. This means that to deliver material to just one site, over 60,000 trips would have been required. 60,000 wagons, moving in an endless caravan. Where are the traces of this grandiose transportation operation? Where are the stables for thousands of horses? Where are the supplies of fodder? Where are the repair shops for the wagons? None of this exists. Around these buildings in old photos, there is silence, emptiness, and dirt. Pay attention to the quality of the brick itself and the masonry. This is not the loose, crooked brick we find in ordinary houses of that period. This is a ringing geopolymer stone of perfect shape. The joints between them are sometimes thinner than a knife blade. We see intricate ornaments, projecting cornices, arches that hold without a single iron rod, solely due to precise load calculation. Official history tells us that this was built by immigrants and laborers for a couple of dollars a day. Do you seriously believe that a peasant who just picked up a trowel yesterday is capable of laying a vaulted ceiling that will stand for a century and a half without a single crack? For such work, dynasties of stonemasons, passing down secrets of their craft for centuries, would be needed. Where did they disappear to immediately after the completion of these facilities? Why, after roughly 1900, did humanity suddenly forget how to build this way and switch to primitive constructions? The answer is obvious. We did not build these buildings. We found them. Now let's look at the plans of these complexes from a bird's-eye view. Most of them are built according to the so-called Kirkbride plan. We are told that this is a scheme for better ventilation and lighting. Long wings extending from a central dome, arranged in a stepped pattern. But if you look at diagrams of modern microchips or antenna arrays, you will see a frightening similarity. This is fractal geometry. This is a waveguide scheme. The buildings are oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of fractions of a degree. Why such precision for a mental hospital? What difference does it make to an insane person whether their window faces strictly north or slightly northeast? But if we assume that these buildings were technical structures, stations for collecting or generating energy, then everything falls into place. The central dome is not just an ornament. Beneath it were always huge, empty spaces, often with metal spires at the top. This is a classic scheme for an atmospheric capacitor. Let's go inside. The heating and ventilation system in these palaces is a separate topic for investigation, one that would merit a Nobel Prize if it were awarded for rediscovering what was lost. In the basements of these buildings, huge brick-lined tunnels are found, large enough for a locomotive to pass through. We are told these are air ducts. Supposedly, cold air entered there, was heated by steam radiators, and rose passively 5 stories up, heating the gigantic halls. Thermal engineers today laugh at these explanations. To move such a volume of air without powerful electric blowers, a draft like that of an open hearth furnace would be needed. But where is the soot? Where are the traces of burning? The ventilation shafts of these buildings are as clean as an operating room. This suggests that the heat source was different, not coal and not wood. The walls of these buildings are permeated with channels that, perhaps, worked as heat exchangers, using energy from the earth or the ether. And then, when the new masters of life seized these complexes, they simply installed their primitive pot-belly stoves and boilers, which barely coped with heating, and called it a progressive system. And what about the furniture and interiors?
In rare photographs, taken before the buildings were reduced to ruins or rebuilt,
we see furnishings worthy of imperial palaces. Huge mirrors in gilded frames, potted palm trees, grand pianos, libraries with thousands of leather-bound volumes. And amidst all this splendor sit people in gray robes with vacant eyes. The contrast is so striking that it causes cognitive dissonance. We are told that doctors tried to create a home-like atmosphere, but this is not a home-like atmosphere. This is an atmosphere of high society. Where would state institutions get budgets for mahogany and velvet? Or perhaps all of this was already there? Perhaps these unfortunate patients were simply wandering among the remnants of the luxury of a previous civilization, which the new authorities hadn't yet managed to plunder. There is another grim fact that historians try not to publicize. A huge number of these magnificent buildings burned to the ground. Moreover, the fires occurred according to a remarkably similar scenario. An ignition in the attic or basement, and within a few hours, a colossal brick building, with walls 3 feet thick, burns so thoroughly that only the outer skeletons remain. Brick does not burn. To reduce a building to such a state, temperatures like those in a crematorium are needed. An ordinary fire leaves blackened walls and burnt floorboards, but it does not turn stone into dust. It creates the impression that these buildings were destroyed intentionally. Evidence was destroyed. As soon as the maintenance of these gigantic complexes became unprofitable, or when someone started asking too many questions about the strange mechanisms in the basements, a fire would occur. This was a cleanup of the traces of a great civilization whose technologies we still cannot understand. Consider the global nature of this phenomenon. This is not a phenomenon of one country. Exactly the same buildings, constructed to the same impossible standards, stand in Australia, in Canada, in Europe, in the Russian Empire. Everywhere, the same architecture. Everywhere, the same red brick, white stone, arched windows, towers. This is the signature of a single global civilization. It could not be that architects on different continents, without the internet and instant communication, synchronously began to build identical palaces for the insane. This indicates that the buildings belong to one era, one empire that controlled the entire world. An empire that was erased from history textbooks, leaving us only pathetic explanations about Victorian style and Dr. Kirkbride's humanitarianism. We live on the ruins of giants, and we have been forbidden to raise our heads and look at the spires reaching into the sky. But the most terrifying discovery awaits us when we begin to understand who exactly and why they were locked within these walls. We are approaching the most frightening and carefully guarded secret of the 19th century, the demographic paradox. If we set aside history textbooks and pick up a calculator and statistical handbooks, a cold dread will seize us. Official data on population growth during this period contradict all laws of biology. We are told that urban populations doubled and tripled in a matter of decades. Historians attribute this to urbanization and the influx of peasants. But wait, in the absence of antibiotics, with monstrous child mortality reaching 40%, amidst constant epidemics of cholera and typhoid, such natural growth is impossible. Women physically could not give birth to enough children to offset mortality and ensure explosive growth. Where then did these millions of people come from, filling the cities and, consequently, these giant mental hospitals? Here we arrive at the main conspiracy theory, the theory of repopulation. Imagine that these enormous palace asylums were not places of isolation, but rather distribution centers, or, if you will, adaptation centers. These buildings were designed to accommodate thousands of people. Kitchens equipped with industrial-scale boilers, capable of cooking soup for an entire regiment. Laundries with mechanisms that look like factory workshops. This is infrastructure for the mass processing of huge numbers of people. Who were actually kept there? In the archives of many asylums, patient diagnoses are baffling. People were listed there with diagnoses such as nostalgia, religious excitement, or novel reading. This is not a joke. These are real entries in patient admission ledgers. Consider the meaning of the word nostalgia. It is a longing for home. What home were thousands of people longing for, finding themselves in a new, rebuilt world? Perhaps for the world that was destroyed and buried under clay. There is a hypothesis that these institutions served as centers for reprogramming consciousness. Survivors of the catastrophe, who retained memories of the technologies and way of life of the great empire, posed a mortal danger to the new elites who had seized power. They could not simply be killed. There were too many of them. They needed to be isolated and declared insane. A person claiming that we used to fly through the sky and get electricity from the air in the new primitive world of coal and steam automatically became insane. These palaces became prisons for memory, and those very horrific treatments, ice baths, rotating chairs, lobotomy, insulin shock, were tools for erasing personality. This was not medicine. These were tortures aimed at suppressing will and erasing memories of the past. Look at the architecture again, but this time from the perspective of sound physics. We've already discussed fractal geometry. Many alternative history researchers claim that these buildings were originally temples of healing through sound and vibration. High vaults, dome resonators, special wall masonry, all this created a unique acoustic environment. It is known that certain frequencies can regenerate tissues and harmonize the psyche. Perhaps, in their heyday, these palaces were sanatoriums where people were healed not with pills, but with resonance. But when civilization fell, the new masters found these complexes, but lost the keys to the technologies. They saw a complex system, but didn't know how to turn it on. As a result, halls designed for divine harmony were filled with the screams of the unfortunate, and the echo that was supposed to heal drove people mad. Another shocking fact is the absence of cemeteries commensurate with the scale of these institutions. Over half a century, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of patients passed through major asylums. Mortality was high. Where are their graves? Usually, such hospitals have small, modest graveyards with nameless markers, etched only with numbers. But the number of these markers is incomparable to the actual death toll. Where did the bodies go? In the basements of some institutions, ovens are found, which official history calls incinerators. But the size of the fireboxes and their construction are eerily reminiscent of industrial-scale crematories. Could these palaces of mercy have been conveyors of death, where those who could not be re-educated were disposed of? This is a terrifying conjecture, but it explains why the demographic statistics of that time diverge so sharply from reality. The dead souls were simply not accounted for, or conversely, new biographies were assigned to them. Let's return to the building materials. In the walls of some ruined asylums, metal ties and rebar are found, the composition of which baffles metallurgists. This is iron that has not rusted for 150 years. Today, we struggle to achieve such anti-corrosion properties with complex chemistry. Yet we are told that these were forged by rural blacksmiths. Furthermore, conductors are found embedded in the brickwork. Why would copper bus bars be encased in the wall of a mental hospital? There is no official answer. The alternative version suggests the walls themselves were part of an electrical circuit. The entire building was a giant device. Perhaps it collected atmospheric electricity for lighting and heating, as we discussed earlier. When this system stopped working, or was intentionally disconnected, the buildings became cold stone shells, uninhabitable, and had to be hastily repurposed as prisons for the insane. And most importantly, the maps. There are old city maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries on which these gigantic complexes are already marked, but under different names, or no names at all. How is this possible if they were officially laid out only in 1870? Historians will tell you it's a cartographer's error, or planned development. But the plans match reality down to the foot. This means only one thing. The buildings stood there long before Dr. Kirkbride supposedly drew his first blueprint. They were simply rediscovered. Authorship was claimed, a legend of humanitarianism was invented, and the legacy that does not belong to us began to be exploited. We look at these majestic ruins and see only pain and madness, though in reality, these may be the last testimonies of humanity's golden age, which was stolen from us. We are approaching the very edge of the abyss. If these buildings were not built in the 19th century, if they were used as internment camps for those who remembered the truth, and if the population was artificially replaced or rebooted, then who are we? Descendants of those who survived this purge? Or perhaps we are products of that very new system, grown in incubators of oblivion. Let's talk about energy. This is a key point that shatters the official version. The area of such complexes often exceeded 1 million square feet. The ceiling height was 13 to 16 feet. The volume of air that needed to be heated in winter is colossal. The official version, coal-fired heating. Let's calculate. To maintain a temperature of at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit in such a volume with poor insulation, and huge windows mean enormous heat loss, railway carloads of coal would be needed. Daily. Each such asylum would have required a dedicated freight rail line working solely for fuel delivery. And there would be mountains of ash and clinker that needed to be hauled away somewhere. Around these buildings, there should be a black desert of coal dust and soot. But in old photos, the walls are pristine. The white stone gleams. No mountains of ash. No coal storage areas the size of a football field. This is a physical impossibility. Either everyone froze to death there, which might have happened to patients after the buildings were seized, or the buildings were originally designed for a different type of energy. Etheric energy. Atmospheric electricity. Those very spires and domes that we take for decorations were receivers. The red brick walls containing metals acted as capacitors. Heat was generated by the building's very structure. These were autonomous, perpetual machines for living. But after the catastrophe, the switch was turned off, or the ionosphere broke down. The new masters, these primitive squatters who occupied the palaces, simply didn't understand how it worked. They punched holes in the walls for their potbelly stovepipes, destroying the unique wiring, and started burning furniture and parquet. We live in a parasitic civilization that uses the body of a slain host without understanding its anatomy. Now about the social aspect. Why create an aura of horror around these places? Why specifically a madhouse? This is a brilliant move of informational cover-up. If you want to hide something important, something that raises questions, make that place one of fear. Call it a plague ward, a prison, or an asylum for the insane. A normal person will avoid that place by a mile. No one will go exploring basements where strange generators stand if they know that violent, homicidal psychopaths are confined there. Fear is the best guard. The walls of these institutions protected not patients from society, but the secrets of the ancient world from curious eyes. Those who entered never returned, or returned with brainwashed minds, unable to tell what they had seen in the endless underground tunnels. There's another unsettling nuance: genetics. Doctors of that era were obsessed with ideas of eugenics and heredity. Mass sterilization experiments were conducted in these asylums, officially to prevent the proliferation of madness. But if we accept the theory that madmen were declared to be representatives of an old race, giant humans, which skeletons are still found and hidden, people with paranormal abilities, then the picture changes. This was genocide, the systematic destruction of the gene pool of the previous civilization. We were turned into obedient, homogenized biomass, stripped of the memory and abilities of our ancestors. We became shorter. We live shorter lives. We get sick more often. We are degenerates compared to those who built these palaces. And these buildings stand as a silent reproach to our degradation. Do you feel your usual worldview crumbling? Do you understand that the progress we are so proud of is merely a pathetic attempt to restore crumbs of what we had beneath our feet just 200 years ago? We didn't invent electricity. We rediscovered it. We didn't invent central heating. We copied it, and poorly at that. These buildings are like a message in a bottle. They scream to us, "Wake up! You've been robbed!" They stole not just history from you, they stole greatness. They made you believe that your ancestors were dirty peasants who suddenly, with a wave of a magic wand, built Rome, St. Petersburg, and Washington with a chisel and hammer. This is a lie that insults intelligence. Look closely at the detailing of the facades. There is no Christian symbolism. There are no crosses. They were erected later. There are lions, griffins, urns, solar signs, floral ornaments. This is the symbolism of a Vedic solar civilization unified across the entire planet. Tartaria? Atlantis? Call it what you will. The essence is not in the name, but in the fact of its existence and total destruction. Asylums for the insane are repurposed temples of the sun, temples of light, transformed into dungeons. This is the cruelest irony in human history: to turn a palace of knowledge into a house of sorrow. And now, with many of these buildings standing abandoned, we see how the system continues to cover its tracks. They are not restored. They are demolished. Despite public protests, despite their historical value, bulldozers arrive and, overnight, turn a masterpiece into a pile of broken brick. Why such haste? What are they afraid of? They are afraid that modern independent researchers with ground-penetrating radar and spectral analysis will find things within the walls that will definitively shatter official history. They are clearing the evidence. Time is working against them. The truth seeps through cracks in the foundation, through archival inconsistencies, through a collective memory that could not be completely erased. We stand on the threshold of a grand discovery, and the keys to it lie in the ruins of these cursed places.